All right, guys, welcome back to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. Again, I'm your host, Aaron Farmer. We are joined here today by Amy Berger. So Amy is an Air Force veteran, so is my father, so thank you for your service. I appreciate that. She is a certified nutrition specialist who specializes in low-carb and ketogenic nutrition to help people reclaim their vitality through eating delicious foods and showing them that getting and staying well doesn't require starvation, deprivation, or living in a gym. Her motto is real people need real food. She blogs over at Two Nutrition, which is a fantastic blog. You guys need to check it out. We'll put links to that in the show notes. And she's the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, using a low-carb, high-fat diet to fight Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, and cognitive decline. So, Amy, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo on your side. Does it sound okay to you?
Yeah, maybe Diane, when I'm talking, if you'll hit the mute button.
I don't have one on my phone.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. All right.
Yeah, you were cutting out. I don't know why.
Oh, hopefully this will.
It's better now. It's better now.
This is actually the first one that we recorded with the two of us in the same room. So we're doing our best to get this straightened out. So again, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here.
Sure.
I finished your book about 6 months ago. I kept meaning to get you on the show, and I you can't fall through the cracks. Unfortunately, I couldn't figure out the time to get you. So I appreciate you coming on. But before we talk about Alzheimer's, which is really what I want to talk about, I wanted to get into your background. How did you discover this? You know, what was the path that led you to dealing with nutrition?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for reading my book. Love to hear that people have read it and find it helpful. I came into low carb the way a lot of people do. I initially came into it for weight loss, and I had tried to lose weight a million other ways. I mean, you name it, the cabbage soup diet, Weight Watchers. I was not afraid of a hard workout. I ran 2 marathons, worked out a ton, and the weight never budged no matter what I did. And I was never obese, but I was certainly chubby, and I was especially chubby compared to what I was eating and how I was working out. It didn't seem to make any sense. And I spent so many years beating myself up and, blaming myself and internalizing that failure. What's wrong with me? I'm such a failure. Why can't I do this? Why is everyone else thinner than me? They never even work out. They eat garbage. It's so unfair. And it is unfair, but no one ever said life was going to be fair. And, I stumbled upon the Atkins diet. I came into this through Atkins. My mother actually picked up a copy of the 1992 version of Dr. Atkins' New Diet Revolution at a yard sale. And she never read it, but I read it. And it made sense. It just made sense. So I tried it and I never looked back. And to be honest with anyone listening out there, low carb didn't stick the first time I tried it. I was actually in college, and I just wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared to do this for the long haul. So I did kind of stop and start a couple of times. It didn't stick for the long term until around 2003. And but now that I've been in this for so long and been researching it for so long and learning about it, I always tell people that at this point, weight loss is the least impressive thing to me at this point that this diet does. I mean, considering that you can get off, so many, if not all of your diabetes meds and your antacid and your blood pressure meds, and by the way, you might also lose a couple of pounds along the way. And I wasn't always a nutritionist. I mean, I was a career changer. I went back to graduate school for nutrition in my early 30s. So, I went to school for nutrition after I had already been eating low carb for a long time and kind of wanted to get a formal education in it.
So your interest in nutrition happened after you found the Atkins diet?
Yes.
Okay. We just had somebody show up at the door.
This is real life,
They called me on the phone. They're at the door. I apologize for all that. Pardon me, we should have shut that door. So that path is an interesting one, and it's one that I'm fascinated by because the first thing you did was you started losing weight, you started fixing your diet, you started improving all of these things about your health, and then you went in and studied nutrition, and so you kind of went into your nutrition studies with this idea in mind. You didn't have to be deprogrammed. How was that? I mean, because I've talked to a lot of nutritional experts here, and they said that's the hardest thing is you have to take everything and kind of unlearn it and relearn it, everything brand new. How did you feel going through that process?
Yeah, you said it exactly right. I feel fortunate that I didn't have to unlearn, years or decades of misinformation. And so I did go into school already knowing about low carb. And what I loved about studying like the basic science, basic anatomy and physiology, basic biochemistry, what I loved about it is that helped me understand why low carb does what it does. Like, oh, that's how my cells work. That's how my pancreas works. That's what my mitochondria do. No wonder keto and low carb, do the things that they do.
Exactly.
What really fascinated me though is, or maybe not fascinated, more like frustrated or disappointed me is that, people in my nutrition program, certainly not everyone was eating low carb. We had some vegetarians in the class. We had like balanced diet people, wholesome, whatever, real food diet people. And how could we learn the exact same biochemistry and the exact same anatomy and come away with such different interpretations of it? Somebody could look at the same biochemical pathway that I just learned, and I think, oh, well, keto is obviously the way to go. And someone else thinks, oh, obviously red meat is bad for you. So that's interesting. But, certainly, even though we had very different perspectives on it, everybody was there to learn and to attempt to help people. And I mean, the reason that I even went to school for nutrition is I was working for the government at the time doing totally unrelated work, and I was so unhappy. And I knew that, I love nutrition. I love talking about low carb. I love helping people understand how this works. Like maybe I could make a career out of that, but I didn't. There's plenty of people in the low carb and keto space and other dietary paradigm spaces who have no formal training whatsoever, no fancy letters after their name, but they're brilliant and they're very well respected and they're making good money and they're helping people. So, formal education isn't required, but for me and the way I'm wired, I knew that I wanted to have that, like some credentials, it would make me feel better being in the public eye and having at least some type of credential.
Exactly. So where did you, or how did you decide to go into looking at Alzheimer's? What led you to that?
Well, if you and your listeners or viewers are familiar with Gary Taubes and the book Good Calories, Bad Calories,
Absolutely.
That's the first place I ever heard about a connection between glucose, insulin, and Alzheimer's. And I don't have any family history of Alzheimer's, so it wasn't that interesting to me, but it was kind of like, oh, that's funny, imagine that. And I sort of filed it away in the back of my mind as something to look into some other day. And it was about 4 years later that I was in school for nutrition and I had to pick my thesis topic. And when we did a thesis, you could do an original experiment or like a scientific literature review. And I did the literature review. And when I had to pick a topic, I said, let me go back to that Alzheimer's thing and see, like, is there even enough published research on this that I could do a thesis? And when I started looking, like just the initial search, I was overwhelmed at how much there was. It was everywhere. They call it type 3 diabetes, diabetes of the brain insulin resistance. It was everywhere and nobody was talking about it. And so I wrote the thesis and I learned a ton, kept on learning, kept reading more papers about it. And after I graduated, I was like, I have to get this information out to people who need it because otherwise it's going to sit on my laptop. It's going to sit on my professor's desk. No one's ever going to know this. And I truly believe it is life-changing, life-saving information. And nobody's talking about it. The Alzheimer's Association isn't talking about it. You're not going to hear any of the stuff in my book from your average neurologist. So I wrote it because I couldn't imagine keeping this information to myself.
So I feel about Alzheimer's the same way I feel about type 2 diabetes in that it looks like there's a very simple, not simple, but it looks like there's a path to improving your chances of, living a long time with Alzheimer's or just avoiding Alzheimer's, in the first place. But because there's no pill, because there's no, because it's cheap, basically, it's not something that gets talked about. It's not something that gets dealt with. No one's talking about dietary changes. Is that the way you feel as well? Do you feel that level of frustration?
Yeah, I think what frustrates me most is that when I read popular press articles or hear news reports, but like news articles on, CNN or the New York Times or whatever news outlet, and they're talking about Alzheimer's, you never, ever, ever see anyone discussing the fundamental, most important aspect of the disease, which is that the brain is not metabolizing glucose properly. So the neurons are basically starving. It's an energy shortage in the brain, and they never talk about that. They talk about crossword puzzles, and they talk about letting the brain get lazy and like all this nonsense that's just ridiculous. They're not. That's what frustrates me. And I do think there's probably relatively simple things that we can do to, I'm always careful to say potentially prevent this illness that are not being talked about. And we don't know for sure what causes this. I mean, even to this day, even in things like type 2 diabetes, we've been researching this for over 100 years, and the experts are still debating what actually causes it. But not knowing the cause doesn't change the fact that we know some interventions that do really, really good jobs of reversing it, like a ketogenic or low carb. You know what I mean? Just because we don't have all the answers doesn't mean we don't know the end solution.
Right. If you have a puzzle that you've put together, 900 of 1,000 pieces, you have a pretty good idea of what that puzzle looks like.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing. So let's talk about Alzheimer's for a little bit. I know that you just said that there's a lot that we don't know. What do we know? What are we relatively sure of that causes Alzheimer's and is leading is leading people to these maybe not Alzheimer's, but even mild cognitive, impairment. What's happening?
Right. Well, mild cognitive impairment, I'll just call it MCI for short, is the precursor to Alzheimer's. I mean, if you get that and you don't really do anything to change your diet, lifestyle, environment, you're gonna get Alzheimer's down the line, unless you die of something else before that happens. I mean, that's the grim truth. And the other truth is we don't know what causes this. We can speculate. We don't know what the actual causes are, but the problem, whatever causative things are there, the problem is that the brain is not properly metabolizing glucose. And we do know certain risk factors for sure. There's one particular gene called the ApoE4 that very, very dramatically increases susceptibility. It doesn't cause Alzheimer's because you can have ApoE4 genes and not develop Alzheimer's, and millions of people that have Alzheimer's don't have the ApoE4 genes. But that is a huge risk factor. More and more, even in the popular press now, and sometimes in the medical journals, you're starting to see more publishing of the fact that chronically high blood sugar over time is a risk factor for developing dementia later in life. And they say not even high blood sugar, like not even in the diabetic range, but just high normal, elevated blood sugar. And chronic hyperinsulinemia. So even when somebody's blood sugar is normal, if the insulin is high all the time, that is a major, major driving factor or contributing risk factor, I should say, for this illness that I talk about a lot in the book.
Yeah, because we live in a world where you can actually spike your insulin and not spike your blood sugar, because it looks like diet sodas and things like this, a lot of these sweeteners that people are using on a ketogenic diet and it's so hard to know because it's so hard to test, and it may be different for some people than other, but it looks like that there's evidence that we are capable of spiking insulin and not spiking blood sugar.
Well,
do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it varies because certainly I know plenty of people, myself included, that do use artificial sweeteners, do drink diet sodas from time to time, and we have no problem. I mean, my insulin is fine, everything's fine. But I would say the problem, even more than any potential insulin issues from quote unquote like fake sugar, artificial sweeteners, more than that is the actual real sugar. Because literally some people can eat a donut and drink a glass of orange juice, and an hour later their blood sugar is fine, but their blood sugar is fine because the insulin is through the roof. And that's the problem. I mean, they just did, if your viewers are familiar with Dave Feldman and his cholesterol work, he was just on a video with somebody looking at twin sisters, one of whom was on a ketogenic diet, one of whom wasn't. And their blood work was almost identical. Even the A1C, almost the same, the fasting glucose, the same. What was different is the sister not on the low carb diet had an insulin about 4 times higher. And you would never know that if you didn't measure insulin, if you only looked at the glucose. Or the A1C, they both look totally healthy. But here we have this metabolic problem brewing in the one sister that we wouldn't know unless we look at the insulin.
So when I was 400 pounds, I did a blood test one time at like one of those CVS things. The at the I can't even think, the pharmacy, yeah. And I walked out of there and I texted my wife and said, well, good news, I don't have diabetes. My A1C was fine. I was 400 pounds and my A1C was fine. And it was just because I had a fantastic ability to take blood sugar, put it out of my bloodstream really, really quickly, and put it into a fat cell. And most people don't know that your A1C is not the be all end all when it comes to your health.
No, definitely not. And the thing is, not everybody who gets to that weight will be hyperinsulinemic.
Right.
Some of them are exquisitely insulin sensitive, which means their body is responding to insulin by storing energy, store, become 300 or 400 pounds, and their insulin could be normal. I mean, it's not a new area of research, but it's newly recognized among all of us how important this is.
Absolutely. So just to get back to Alzheimer's, you mentioned that Alzheimer's is essentially a disease of not being able to metabolize glucose well in the brain. So are we talking glucose resistance, just like when we're talking about that with a type 2 diabetic? They just, with the diabetic, their muscle cells essentially lose the ability to metabolize glucose well, and so the only choice the body has is to put it into a fat cell. I mean, there's a couple other choices, but it's the idea. Is that what's happening in the brain as well?
That's a good question. I wouldn't call it glucose resistance. I would call it glucose refusal mode. Okay. Because it's not that there's not glucose in the body, right? Like you could drink some juice, eat a scone, have a bagel. Your body is flooded with glucose, but for some reason, the brain is not taking it up and metabolizing it. And Dr. Stephen Cunnane, who does really, really awesome research on this up in Canada, has done some studies where they show that in the early stages of Alzheimer's, the glucose uptake is fine. The brain will suck it up, but it won't use it. But after a while of the brain not using it, it stops taking it up. It's like a supply and demand thing. If there's no demand, then there's no need for a big supply. So as the brain stops metabolizing it, over time it stops taking it up. They actually can measure this by PET scan. I don't know if your viewers are aware, but in cancer patients, they'll give you a PET scan. They inject you with like a radio labeled type of glucose so they can see where the tumors are and where it's spread to, because the cancerous tumors will suck up glucose and light up the PET scan like a Christmas tree. It's the opposite in Alzheimer's disease. They'll inject you with the glucose to measure how much the brain is not taking up and metabolizing. It's really fascinating. So I think that the brain, and I go into this in the book, I go into this in some of the talks I've given in public, the brain, the mitochondria, these neurons are so damaged from so many years of ceaseless glucose onslaught that they start inducing biochemical mechanisms that do limit the metabolism of glucose. So I wouldn't use the phrase resistance. I would say they're in glucose refusal mode as the protective measure. They're already so damaged that they're like, no, I don't want more glucose. I don't care how much carbohydrate and sugar you eat. I'm not going to metabolize it.
So these things these ways that the brain deal with glucose, is that the amyloid plaques? Is that, we hear so much about these plaques showing up in the brain of Alzheimer's patients? Are these plaques the protective measures that the brain is using to limit glucose intake?
I think they are. So this amyloid stuff is very controversial. There's a huge controversy now. There's an old sort of established conventional school of thought that holds that amyloid and amyloid plaques are the cause of Alzheimer's, right? And if we could just get rid of these plaques, get rid of these proteins, then we've just cured Alzheimer's. There's another school of thought that is saying that doesn't fit the scientific evidence that we've accumulated to date. It sounded good 20 or 30 years ago. It made sense 20 or 30 years ago. Now that we have a lot more data and a lot more understanding of this illness, it doesn't make any sense. And they're moving away from what they call the amyloid cascade hypothesis to the mitochondrial cascade hypothesis. So amyloid, just as a real quick primer, is this protein that's secreted by the neurons. And everybody's brain does this, not just Alzheimer's. Healthy brains secrete amyloid. This is a normal thing. The problem in Alzheimer's disease is that they're not cleared away properly. And when they're not cleared away properly, they build up and they like cross-link with each other and solidify outside the cells, forming these infamous amyloid plaques. And these plaques actually do physically get in the way of neuronal communication. They block neurons being able to communicate with each other. So it makes sense, oh, we should get rid of this amyloid. But the amyloid does seem more and more to be being secreted for a protective reason. Part of it is it helps generate compounds that are restorative, reparative. We see a lot of amyloid in traumatic brain injury, probably for the same reason. It's not a bad thing. It's a very similar deal with cholesterol. We have this one substance that the body produces, probably because the body needs it for some reason. And sometimes when we have a disease state like cardiovascular disease, sometimes people have a high cholesterol, sometimes they have a low cholesterol. And in Alzheimer's disease, this has been shown too. Not everybody who has Alzheimer's has a lot of plaque buildup. And there's some people that die from other causes that are found to have a lot of plaque. So either the plaque isn't the cause of the disease or it's not the primary cause. And we've like demonized this one substance. In the case of Alzheimer's, it's amyloid. In the case of cardiovascular disease, it's cholesterol. And if we could just develop a drug to like reduce this thing as much as possible, we've just cured the disease. And we've seen that that's not true with statins and with other cholesterol lowering drugs. In some very small select patient populations, it may offer some degree of protection with the cholesterol, but in Alzheimer's disease, every anti-amyloid drug developed so far has been a failure. These drugs do reduce the formation of the amyloid proteins and plaques, but that reduction has never been shown to have any positive impact on the actual disease. So you have less amyloid, but guess what? You still die from Alzheimer's disease just as quickly as you would have died without the drug.
Yeah, there was a study that just came out like in the last week where they had cleared out something like 90% of the amyloid plaques in rats with this drug. Didn't do anything to the disease. It
never does. And I should say, because you asked specifically about the relationship with the glucose, and this is an important point, not to geek out too much, but amyloid inhibits one of the enzymes involved in glucose metabolism. So it's like, okay, slam dunk, this amyloid is putting the brakes on glucose metabolism. We have to get rid of the amyloid. But why don't we think, why is the amyloid doing this? Why is the brain secreting this amyloid? It's not doing it for no reason. And again, I think that this is the brain's way of saying, I'm already hurting so much and I'm so damaged from so many years of glycation and oxidation from all this glucose influx that I'm going to secrete this protein that actually protects me by not letting me metabolize any more glucose.
Exactly. We see something similar when we're dealing with type 2 diabetics. You know, you mentioned cholesterol with cardiovascular disease. Well, diabetics have the same thing with insulin. You know, that these type 2 diabetics, they just keep getting more and more insulin put into their system, and the doctors keep prescribing more and more insulin, and it never occurs to anyone to say, hey, you know, this is actually making the problem worse. And maybe the problem is too much insulin. So it's the same thing with Alzheimer's. Maybe the issue is just too much glucose over the course of a life. And the answer is to take the glucose out of the diet.
Right.
So that's incredible. Do you, looking forward kind of at the future of this disease, actually, I want to ask this question first. Your paper came out. How long has your book been out?
My book just came out about a year and a half ago, March 2017.
That's what I thought. Have you seen any impact with your book in the research community? Have you gotten contacted by people who've read your book and thought, okay, maybe we're looking at this the wrong way and people need to think about this differently?
Unfortunately, no, not at all. I can say within the low carb community and the keto community, it is growing quickly. I'm very honored that I've been invited to speak multiple times this year to give my Alzheimer's talk. And I think a lot of the low carb doctors and nutritionists and dietitians already knew something about like, oh, type 3 diabetes, that could be an insulin thing. But when I give my talk, they really learn the details as to just how much supporting scientific evidence there is for this. So I think it's growing within the research community. It's growing in the ivory tower. It's growing in the labs. It is unfortunately not trickling down to the average family doctor's office or the average neurologist even. I mean, no neurologist is going to tell you, hey, The fundamental problem right now, the thing causing your cognitive impairment, is that your brain is starving for fuel.
Right.
For whatever reason, we don't know the exact reason, but your brain is not properly metabolizing glucose. Maybe we should try giving it some other fuel. I mean, that's a whole separate issue, but I don't see it trickling down. But Dale Bredesen is an MD who wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's, and his book has sold multiple tens of thousands more copies than mine have. I'm not jealous. I think that's a great thing because at least he's bringing the message. He doesn't support the ketogenic diet quite as adamantly as I do. He calls his diet keto light, but it is a ketogenic oriented diet. And it's a whole lifestyle protocol. It's not just like a one mono, intervention. It's multiple things happening at once to diet and lifestyle. So I think that's really promising. Unfortunately, for all the people that think he's brilliant and think he's doing great work, there's people that, Bredesen's a quack, this is nonsense. So it's like very hard to convince the professionals and the experts, but it's like anything, like low carb, keto, paleo, whatever, it's going to come from the ground up. It's going to come from the patients because it's not coming from the top.
Yeah. Diane, can you talk a little bit about your mother? Her mother just celebrated her 90th birthday. Sharp as a tack, never had any issues with it, and just an amazing woman.
Well, she doesn't have any background, family history of Alzheimer's either. So it's kind of, my grandfather used to tease about it, but he lived till 92. And so my grandmother would have lived as long, but she was what my mother calls nosy. And so she kept looking in places she shouldn't be and falling, hurting herself. So she not, she didn't live as long, but they lived a healthy lifestyle. They lived a healthy lifestyle. They did everything their doctor told them to. They ate exactly as the doctor told them to. They took the medicines the doctor said and did exercise just like, the doctor said. And, but my mom, we put her on a ketogenic diet a couple of years ago. She was, she walked down the hall. She lives with us. She walked down the hall past my office one day and I was like, man, she's all humped over and walking slow. And it just wasn't like Mom. And so I said, we're just going to put you on this ketogenic diet. The only complaint she ever had was she couldn't open jars and that kind of thing. All that went away. She doesn't feel like she has arthritis anymore. She doesn't feel like anything like that. She was losing weight. She told me all her life that her best weight was between 118 and 120. And she got down to 118 and she was like, I've lost too much weight. And I was like, but you said your best weight was 118. And so she's stuck at 118 now and for the last 2 years, and she feels great. But she is sharp as a tack. But she also has read and believed everything that they say about keeping your mind, working. So she loves to do all kinds of games and puzzles and reads excessively. So, but like I said, she doesn't have any history of Alzheimer's, so I don't know.
Well, I don't think, I should clarify, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing crossword puzzles and keeping your mind active and learning a language or, playing an instrument or something, but that's not a cure for Alzheimer's disease.
Right.
Because,
exactly.
There's PhDs, there's accountants, there's brilliant people that get this illness. So can we blame it on intellectual laziness? Should they have published more papers? Should they have done more research? And I do think, I think there's a lot of other forms of cognitive impairment or cognitive decline that are labeled Alzheimer's, but to me, Alzheimer's should be defined by reduced brain glucose use. There's other forms of cognitive problems that can be caused by, for example, a B12 deficiency, which is very common in older people, especially older people that have been using antacid medication for a long time. Very common iron deficiency, very severe hypothyroidism over time can cause cognitive impairment. So I think there's even some amount of, confusion and memory loss that isn't actually Alzheimer's. So, just talking about your mother, I'm not saying she's lucky. I mean, it sounds like she took active measures to stay healthy and to be active and everything, but everyone has a different carbohydrate tolerance. And so if she was following doctor's orders for a healthy diet, even if that includes, some whole grains and some complex carbohydrate, I'm sure even in the mainstream, doctors aren't saying, hey, eat as much sugar as you want, go home and eat some M&Ms and some Skittles. They would say, whole grain bread, steel cut oats. And so even with all this carb talk, I try to mention in my presentations that it's not carbohydrates per se that are causing this disease. Like, it would be stupid for me to tell you that, apples cause Alzheimer's disease or that chickpeas cause Alzheimer's disease. So each of us has a different level of tolerance that we can eat over however many years and still be healthy and have our cognitive faculties.
Perfect.
Well, I know that I had type 2 diabetes. They diagnosed me with type 2 diabetes before surgery that I was going to have. And I was totally shocked, and hypothyroidism, and I was like, I don't even know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what it is. And the nurse on the phone, she was like, you haven't noticed that your skin is really dry? You haven't noticed that you're really tired? And I'm like, no, I don't, none of that,
Uh-huh.
And so it was all kind of crazy to me. But the thing that I zeroed in on was type 2 diabetes, because I'd had a close dealing with diabetes itself. So I knew that it was something that just eats away at your body until you die. I mean, it just is horrible. And I was not going to do that. So I did the keto diet, lost over 100 pounds. And
That's amazing. You two are amazing. That's fabulous.
Well,
Yeah.
the thing then became the thyroid. That's when we started dealing with more with the thyroid. And I've gained some weight back, and I haven't been able to get rid of it. And so now I'm having to deal with the thyroid part of it. And, and it's really hard to find a doctor to deal with that the way that I feel like it needs to be dealt with. I just haven't been able to. I've been to several different doctors, related to thyroid, and they're just kind of like throwing stuff on the wall to see what sticks.
It is incredibly hard, and I can confirm because I'm on thyroid medication myself. I have hypothyroid, and fortunately, I actually worked with a naturopathic doctor who is very well versed in how to do this properly. But it's a minefield, and I get probably one client a week that has unrecognized hypothyroidism. So then I have to walk them through the correct blood work to get, because most doctors don't even order the right tests. And then once you have the correct blood work, we have to find a doctor that is savvy with interpreting it properly and then find you the right medication. Because even now, I've been on medication for about 2 years, and I'd say every 6 to 8 months, I have to adjust my own dose a little up or down depending on my symptoms. So it is a jungle. It's so difficult to deal with. It is.
It is. And the odd thing to me with it was two of my sons, our sons have been diagnosed as hypothyroid, having hypothyroidism too.
That's interesting, because it's rarer. It's much more common in women than it is in men. It happens in men, but it's much more rare.
But I felt that was odd to me too. But also having two of my kids, my mom, when she was 40, they diagnosed her with hypothyroidism. She got the pills. Her neighbor said, oh, well, you're going to have to take those for the rest of your life. So my mom was like, yeah, right. And she threw them away when she was 40.
Uh-huh.
92. She hasn't taken any thyroid medicine.
Well, good for her.
52 years.
Some people need it. I mean, I hope to get off the medication. It was a last resort. I didn't want to get on medication. I tried for years to fix this naturally, fix it myself, until it got to the point where it was literally unbearable and I couldn't take it one more day. And I do hope to someday figure out why my body isn't working properly and correct that, and maybe, titrate down my dose and get off the meds altogether. But for now, until that happens, I mean, this medication has been life-saving for me, frankly. And if it runs in your family, it might be more of an autoimmune situation. I mean, that's Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune hypothyroid. Mine is not Hashi's, but like the autoimmune thyroid issue is very common. I would imagine that might be what's going on for you if it's running in your family so much, but I don't know.
Yeah, the thing is that I see when I go to the doctor, because my main focus is I don't want the weight. I don't want the weight because I don't want the type 2 diabetes. And they only hear that I vainly don't want the weight. And so they're like, well, and that's all they deal with is my vanity. And it's like, it's not vain. Right. It's a health deal. And they never hear that. But anyway.
So how about, sorry, how about the future of this disease? Are you looking forward to any breakthroughs? Any have you seen anything on the horizon that's gonna help Alzheimer's patients? Anything that you can think of?
Unfortunately, no. Not from the pharmaceutical industry. Not that they're not trying. I mean, I know we all badmouth the pharmaceutical industry all the time. I mean, maybe someday there will be a blockbuster drug. I'm not dismissing that possibility, but I don't see it happening. Like I said earlier, how long have we been researching type 2 diabetes? And pretty much every single drug on the market, except maybe metformin, only makes you worse. Right. Makes the diabetes worse. You need more and more meds over time. You need higher doses. You need additional meds. Do I see a silver bullet blockbuster drug for Alzheimer's coming anytime soon? No. What I see, hopefully, is more and more people finding out little by little about the glucose and insulin connection and learning that this is looking to be every bit a diet and lifestyle disease and a disease of insulin resistance, just like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and PCOS and hypertension and all this other stuff. We take for granted that diet and lifestyle are driving factors in all of those illnesses. And when it comes to Alzheimer's, another what we call non-communicable illness that has exploded in incidence right along with all of those other conditions over the past 50 years or so, why is it that when it comes to Alzheimer's, we dismiss even the possibility that this could also be a diet and lifestyle disease? And I'm not saying it is 100%. I'm willing to be wrong. Maybe there's some pie in the sky thing that we haven't discovered yet. Like maybe it's a virus, maybe it's a bacteria. Signs kind of point to this being absolutely a metabolic disease.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing about all of this that really kind of blew me away was how everything is so interrelated. I mean, really, the cure for type 2 diabetes, for Alzheimer's, I have so many people on this podcast, it's always the same thing. Lower your glucose, eat more saturated fat, and whatever those issues that you're dealing with seem to fix itself. And that so many problems would have a similar solution should be a red flag to somebody, you would think.
You would think. And in case it wasn't clear, because we didn't even really talk about this one point, I mean, the reason that I recommend a low carb or ketogenic diet for the brain for Alzheimer's is because if this is a glucose metabolism problem, the beautiful, most promising, most encouraging thing about this illness is that the brain, even an Alzheimer's racked brain, can still metabolize ketones. So like as the glucose is coming down, the fuel, I'm starving, my neurons are atrophying, now I can nourish these starving cells with ketones. And maybe you're not going to have 100% cognition, but it's going to bridge that gap to some extent. You're going to start feeding these cells. And they've shown this, like not just in rats, not just in mice, but in actual human beings with Alzheimer's disease. For the most part, not every time, but for the most part, people with Alzheimer's or MCI do have improved cognition when they're on a ketogenic diet or they take exogenous ketones.
Speaking of ketones in the brain, I've heard through other people on this podcast that there are parts of the brain that cannot receive ketones, that have to live on glucose. Is that true?
I don't know. I've never heard that, but it wouldn't surprise me. So I feel like there may be a reason that our blood glucose never goes to zero, even on a ketogenic diet. So I mean, there are certainly select cells in other parts of the body that can't use ketones or fats because they don't have mitochondria. Fats and ketones are burned in the mitochondria. So any cell that doesn't have mitochondria, like red blood cells, for example, can't use fats or ketones. They have to use either glucose or lactate or something getting converted into glucose. Maybe there are parts of the brain that are like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the explanation that was given to me was glucose is a much smaller molecule than a ketone, and so that there are places within the brain that the bridge that it has to gap to get to whatever's on the other side of it is the ketone molecule is too big to get over there, but it's a very, very small percentage of parts of the brain that need glucose. So I didn't know. I'd never I'm certainly not a brain doctor. I wasn't sure one way or the other.
Well, I'm not sure of that either, but that's something for me to look into because that's really interesting.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been an absolutely fascinating interview. What's next for Amy Berger?
Well, in terms of what's immediately next is I'm speaking at the Weston A. Price Conference in Baltimore the weekend of the 16th and 17th of November. I'm not sure when this show will air, but then I'm speaking. We're having a retreat in Canada. If you're up in Ontario or anywhere, come to Kingston, Ontario, Saturday, December 1st. I'll be speaking. Megan Ramos from the IDM Clinic will be there. Other than that, I just started a YouTube channel to make short videos that remind people how simple low carb and keto are. Everybody's trying to make it so complicated and so difficult and so expensive, and it doesn't have to be any of those things.
Absolutely.
I'd like to write another book. I just have no idea on what yet, but maybe next year I'll start another book.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put links to all of that in the show notes. And Diane, you have anything else you want to say?
No, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to talk to you.
All right, thank you very much. And guys, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information. Oh, wait a minute.